The Luftwaffe had one aircraft the Allies couldn't touch. It flew so high that interceptors would stall out trying to reach it. So fast that even if you got close, it would just accelerate away. For 2 years, this plane photographed Allied positions with complete impunity. Then one day in 1944, a P-51 Mustang did something everyone said was impossible. It climbed to 35,000 feet, caught a German reconnaissance plane that was supposed to be untouchable, and shot it down. And suddenly, the aircraft that intelligence officers had dismissed as a low-altitude escort fighter became the only thing in the sky that high-altitude Luftwaffe pilots feared. This is the story of how the P-51 Mustang proved everyone wrong, how a plane designed for ground attack became the deadliest high-altitude interceptor of World War II, and how German reconnaissance pilots went from feeling invincible to checking their six every second, knowing that American fighters could now reach them anywhere. But to understand how the P-51 changed high-altitude warfare, we need to talk about the plane that made the Luftwaffe think they owned the sky above 30,000 feet. Because this story starts with a German aircraft that was so advanced, so untouchable, that shooting one down was considered almost impossible. The Junkers Ju-86P, and for most of the war, it was the Luftwaffe's secret weapon for intelligence gathering. The Ju-86 started life as a medium bomber in the 1930s. Nothing special. Decent range, decent payload, completely unremarkable in every way. But in 1940, Junkers engineers had an idea. What if we took this basic airframe and modified it specifically for high-altitude reconnaissance? They stripped out everything unnecessary. Guns, armor, anything that added weight. They added a pressurized cabin so the crew could function at extreme altitude. They installed supercharged diesel engines that could operate in thin air where normal engines would choke and die. And they extended the wings to increase lift in the stratosphere. The result was an aircraft that could cruise at 39,000 feet, almost 8 miles high. At that altitude, the air is so thin you can barely breathe. The temperature is 50 below zero, and normal piston engine fighters just can't get there. The Spitfire, Britain's best interceptor, could maybe reach 36,000 feet on a good day if the pilot pushed it. But by the time it got there, it was wallowing, barely controllable, on the edge of a stall. The engine was gasping for oxygen. The controls were mushy and unresponsive, and the Ju-86P would still be 3,000 feet above you, cruising along like it was a Sunday drive. American fighters were even worse at altitude. The P-40 topped out around 30,000 feet. The P-38 could reach 39,000 feet but took forever to get there, and burned so much fuel doing it that you'd have maybe 5 minutes at that height before you had to descend. The P-47 Thunderbolt was better, designed for high altitude from the start, but early models still struggled above 35,000 feet. So the Ju-86P flew wherever it wanted, over London, over Cairo, over Allied airfields and ports and supply depots, taking photographs, mapping defenses, gathering intelligence, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. British commanders tried everything. They'd scramble Spitfires the moment a Ju-86P was spotted. The Spitfire pilots would climb as hard as they could, maxing out their engines, trying desperately to reach intercept altitude. And they'd watch through their canopies as the German plane cruised overhead, completely out of reach, while they hung there at 36,000 feet with their aircraft shaking and their engine coughing. It was humiliating. The Luftwaffe was photographing British positions in broad daylight, and there was nothing anyone could do. Pilots would land furious, mechanics would check the aircraft and find nothing wrong, and commanders would file reports saying they needed better high-altitude fighters. But designing a new fighter takes years, and the war wasn't waiting. The British eventually developed a specialized high-altitude Spitfire variant, the Mark VI, with extended wings and a pressurized cabin. It could reach 41,000 feet, and actually had a chance of catching a Ju-86P, and in September 1942, a Spitfire VI finally shot one down over Egypt. But there were only a handful of Spitfire VIs built. They were rare, specialized aircraft that couldn't be everywhere at once. The Ju-86P flights continued. Germany kept gathering intelligence, and Allied commanders kept looking for a solution. That's where the P-51 Mustang enters the story. Except at this point, nobody was thinking about the P-51 as a high-altitude fighter, because when it first showed up, the Mustang had a serious problem. The P-51 was designed in 1940 by North American Aviation for the British. The RAF wanted a new fighter and they wanted it fast, so North American threw together a design in 120 days. The result was an aircraft with incredible aerodynamics, long range, and good handling. But it had one major flaw: the engine. The early P-51s used an Allison V1710 engine. This was a great engine at low altitude, reliable, powerful, smooth running. But above 15,000 feet, it was a dog. The Allison didn't have an effective supercharger for high-altitude operation, so as the air got thinner, the engine lost power. A lot of power. This meant the early Mustang was fast and deadly below 15,000 feet, but nearly useless in high-altitude combat. It was relegated to ground attack and tactical reconnaissance. Low-level stuff. The British used it for strafing runs and photo mapping behind German lines at treetop height. American pilots called it a hot rod that couldn't climb. Great if you wanted to buzz a German convoy at 500 feet. Terrible if you needed to escort bombers at 25,000 feet or intercept high-altitude reconnaissance planes. But in 1942, someone had an idea that changed everything. What if you took the Mustang's excellent airframe and replaced the Allison engine with something better? The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was the obvious choice. This was the engine that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber. It had a two-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitude. It was proven, reliable, and available. The first test flight of a Merlin-powered Mustang happened in October 1942. The test pilot took it up to 20,000 feet and opened the throttle. The aircraft just kept accelerating. He climbed to 25,000 feet, still accelerating. He pushed it to 30,000 feet. The engine was still pulling strong. When he landed, he told the engineers they just created the best fighter in the world. He was right. The P-51B, as the Merlin-powered version was designated, could cruise at 440 mph at 30,000 feet. It could climb to 35,000 feet and still have power to maneuver and fight. And it had range, crazy range, with drop tanks. A P-51 could fly escort missions deep into Germany and still have fuel to fight on the way home. The first P-51Bs arrived in Europe in late 1943. They were immediately assigned to bomber escort duty, protecting B-17s and B-24s on daylight raids over Germany, and they were phenomenally good at it. German fighters that had been slaughtering Allied bombers suddenly found themselves facing an American fighter that could match them in speed, outturn them in dogfights, and most importantly, stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. But everyone still thought of the P-51 as a mid-altitude fighter, great at 25,000 feet where the bombers flew, good enough at 30,000 feet. But above that, nobody really knew. The aircraft was capable of reaching extreme altitude, but it hadn't been tested in combat up there. And nobody was thinking about high-altitude reconnaissance interception, because that wasn't the P-51's job. That was for specialized aircraft like the Spitfire VI or the high-altitude P-47 variants. Except the Luftwaffe was still flying reconnaissance missions at 35,000 to 40,000 feet, and they were still getting away with it. German intelligence officers would brief pilots, tell them the Allies had no effective interceptors above 35,000 feet, and send them off to photograph Allied positions with the confidence that they were basically invulnerable. That confidence lasted until March 1944. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Robert Johnson, though not the famous P-47 Ace. Different guy. This Johnson was a P-51 pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, based in England. And on March 10, 1944, he was flying top cover for a bomber formation when ground control radioed about a high-altitude contact. German reconnaissance plane, probably a Ju-86P or maybe a modified Ju-88. Altitude estimated at 37,000 feet, heading west over Allied positions. Johnson's squadron leader made the call. They were going after it, but this wasn't a simple intercept. They were at 28,000 feet. The target was 9,000 feet above them. That's almost 2 miles of vertical distance to cover, and they'd have to do it fast before the German plane finished its photo run and turned for home. Johnson pushed his throttle forward and started climbing. His wingman stayed with him. The rest of the squadron spread out, some guys climbing hard, others maintaining altitude to keep the bombers covered. The P-51's Merlin engine was designed for this. The two-stage supercharger kicked in, compressing the thin air and feeding it to the engine. Where an Allison-powered P-51 would have been gasping and losing power, the Merlin kept pulling. The airspeed indicator was dropping as Johnson climbed, trading speed for altitude, but the engine kept running smooth. At 32,000 feet, he could see the target, a tiny speck against the blue sky, contrail streaming behind it. The German pilot probably hadn't even seen the American fighters yet. Why would he look down? Nobody could reach him up here. Johnson kept climbing. 33,000 feet, 34,000 feet. His controls were getting mushy. The air this thin meant the control surfaces had less air to bite into. Every input had to be smooth and gentle, or the aircraft would depart controlled flight and spin. 35,000 feet. He was level with the German plane now, maybe a mile behind and slightly below. The Germans still hadn't reacted, still flying straight and level, camera clicking away, gathering intelligence on Allied bomber formations and fighter bases. Johnson checked his oxygen. Good. Checked his fuel. Enough. Checked his guns. All 6.50 caliber machine guns were loaded and ready. He was as high as he'd ever flown in combat, higher than his training had covered. The manual probably had warnings about this altitude, but the manual wasn't here and the German reconnaissance plane was. He started his attack run, gently easing the stick forward, diving slightly to build up speed. The airspeed indicator crept up, 280 mph, 300 mph, 320 mph, fast enough. That's when the German pilot saw him. The reconnaissance plane broke hard right, diving for speed. This was their standard escape tactic: dive away from the interceptor, build up speed, and pull away. It had worked against Spitfires. It had worked against P-47's. It should work against this P-51. But Johnson's P-51 was different. The Merlin engine was still making power. The airframe was clean and aerodynamic, and Johnson was committed. He followed the German into the dive, cutting inside the turn, closing the distance. At 34,000 feet, he was 800 yards behind, too far for an effective shot. He kept diving. At 33,000 feet, he was 400 yards behind, getting close. The German pilot was jinking now, throwing his aircraft around, making himself a harder target. But the Ju-86P wasn't built for aerobatics. It was built for high-altitude cruise. Those long wings and pressurized cabin made it stable and efficient, but not nimble. Johnson got to 200 yards, close enough. He centered the gun sight on the German's fuselage and pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns opened up. Tracers arced through the thin air. The first burst missed, passing just behind the target. Johnson adjusted, led the target a bit more, and fired again. This time he hit. He could see the strikes walking up the fuselage. Pieces of metal tore away. The German plane's right engine started smoking. The Ju-86P rolled hard left, trying to evade. But with one engine damaged and the aircraft already stressed from maneuvering at altitude, the pilot was out of options. Johnson followed, fired another burst, and hit the left engine. Both engines were smoking now. The German plane nosed down, picking up speed, trying to get to thicker air where the engines might restart or at least where the pilot could bail out safely. Johnson followed him down to 25,000 feet, firing short bursts every few seconds. The German plane was trailing heavy smoke, losing altitude fast. Then one of the engines caught fire. The pilot had seconds to decide. Stay with the aircraft and try to save it, or bail out and hope the parachute worked. He belayed out. Johnson saw the canopy separate and the pilot jump clear. The parachute opened. The Ju-86P continued down, engine burning, and crashed somewhere in occupied France. Johnson pulled up, checked his fuel, and headed back to base. He'd just done something that Allied intelligence had considered nearly impossible. He'd intercepted and destroyed a German high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft at 35,000 feet in a fighter that everyone thought was designed for lower-altitude work. When he landed and debriefed, the intelligence officers didn't believe him at first. You climbed to 37,000 feet in a Mustang. You caught a Ju-86P. You shot it down. Yes, and yes. They checked his gun camera footage. It confirmed his story. They checked with ground observers who'd seen the German plane go down. Confirmed. They filed a report that went up the chain of command and eventually landed on the desk of every fighter group commander in the European theater. The P-51 could fight at 35,000 feet, and it could win. This changed everything for high-altitude reconnaissance operations, because now the Luftwaffe had a problem. Their reconnaissance pilots couldn't just climb to 38,000 feet and assume they were safe anymore. American P-51s could reach them, and if they could reach them, they could kill them. Word spread fast on both sides. Allied intelligence started tasking P-51 squadrons with high-altitude intercept missions. German intelligence started warning their reconnaissance pilots that the Americans had a new capability and to be more careful. But careful wasn't really an option. Reconnaissance missions required flying predictable patterns at steady speeds to get good photographs. You couldn't just zip around randomly at high altitude and hope to gather useful intelligence. You had to fly slow and steady, which made you vulnerable. The Luftwaffe tried different tactics. They'd fly higher, pushing their aircraft to 40,000 feet or more, but the P-51 could still reach them. It just took longer. They'd fly faster, modified Ju-88s instead of Ju-86Ps, using speed instead of altitude for protection. But the P-51 was faster in level flight and could chase them down. They'd fly at dawn or dusk. Hopping the low light would make them harder to spot. But Allied radar was getting better, and ground controllers could vector P-51s to intercept based on radar plots. Nothing worked. The safe zone above 35,000 feet that had protected German reconnaissance planes for years was gone, and P-51 pilots were racking up kills at altitudes that would have been impossible just months earlier. Lieutenant Arthur Thorson of the 4th Fighter Group got a kill at 38,000 feet in April 1944. He'd been vectored to intercept a contact that ground radar had picked up. He climbed his P-51 to max altitude, spotted the German plane, a modified Ju-88, and engaged at an altitude where he could barely keep his aircraft flying straight. The combat lasted maybe 90 seconds. Both aircraft were operating at the edge of their performance envelopes. Thorson fired 3 bursts, hit the German's left engine, and watched it trail smoke as it dove away. He didn't follow. At that altitude, with his fuel getting low and his aircraft struggling to maintain control, chasing was too risky. but the kill was confirmed by radar tracking and ground observers. Captain James Howard, a Medal of Honor recipient, scored a reconnaissance plane kill at 36,000 feet in May 1944. He was flying lone escort for a bomber that had been separated from its formation when he spotted a German aircraft trailing the bomber, probably gathering intelligence on damage and routing. Howard climbed above the German, dove on him from the sun, and opened fire from 400 yards. The German never saw him coming. One burst, the reconnaissance plane caught fire, and the pilot bilayed out. Howard circled the descending parachute to make sure the pilot made it down safely, then returned to shepherding his bomber home. These kills weren't flukes. They were proof that the P-51 had fundamentally changed the rules of high-altitude warfare. An aircraft that had started life as a low-altitude ground attack fighter was now dominating the stratosphere. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from mid-1944 specifically warned about P-51s at extreme altitude. They told their reconnaissance pilots to abort missions if they spotted Mustangs, even if the Mustangs were thousands of feet below them, because the Americans could and would climb to intercept. Some German pilots didn't listen. They'd been flying high-altitude reconnaissance for years. They dodged Spitfires, outrun P-47s, and laughed at P-38's struggling to reach them. Why should they be afraid of another American fighter? They learned why the hard way. A Ju-86P pilot named Oberleutnant Heinrich Graf was shot down at 39,000 feet in June 1944. He'd been photographing Allied positions in Normandy after D-Day when a pair of P-51s bounced him. He tried to run, pushed his throttles forward, nose down slightly to build speed, did everything that had worked before. But the P-51 stayed with him. At 38,000 feet, one of them got into firing position and hit his pressurized cabin. The cabin depressurized instantly. Graf and his photographer both nearly passed out from hypoxia before getting their oxygen masks on. With the cabin compromised and the aircraft damaged, Graf had no choice but to dive for lower altitude and thicker air. The P-51s followed him down to 20,000 feet before breaking off, probably low on fuel. Graf managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to base, but he never flew a high-altitude reconnaissance mission again. He told his commander that the Americans could reach them anywhere, and it wasn't worth the risk anymore. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had mostly given up on high-altitude daylight reconnaissance over Allied territory. It was just too dangerous. Too many planes lost, too many experienced crews killed or captured, and the intelligence they were gathering wasn't worth the cost. The P-51 had effectively shut down an entire category of German operations, not through overwhelming numbers or superior technology alone, but through performance that nobody had expected. Here's the thing that makes this story interesting. The P-51's high-altitude capability wasn't a secret. The performance data was published. Test pilots had taken it to 40,000 feet and documented how it handled. The information was available. But nobody thought it mattered. High-altitude intercepts were considered a specialized mission requiring specialized aircraft. The P-51 was the bomber escort fighter. It had its role. Why would you use it for something else? This is what military historians call doctrinal blindness. When you get so focused on what an aircraft is supposed to do that you miss what it can do. The British made the same mistake with the Spitfire, using it primarily for point defense when it was capable of so much more. The Germans made it with the Bf-109, which could have been a devastating bomber-destroyer, but was often wasted on fighter sweeps. The Americans almost made it with the P-51, almost relegated it to being just another escort fighter, but pilots like Johnson and Thorson and Howard saw an opportunity and took it. They pushed their aircraft to the limits. They engaged targets that were supposed to be out of reach, and they proved that the P-51 was more versatile than anyone had given it credit for. This had implications beyond just reconnaissance intercepts. If the P-51 could fight effectively at 35,000 feet, it meant American fighters could engage German aircraft at any altitude. There was no safe zone for the Luftwaffe anymore. No altitude where they could operate without fear of interception. This affected bomber intercept tactics. German fighters had sometimes tried climbing above Allied bomber formations and diving on them from high altitude. But if P-51s could fight at 35,000 feet, they could escort the bombers from above, denying the Germans that altitude advantage. It affected fighter tactics in general. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to respect the P-51 at 25,000 feet. Now they had to respect it at 35,000 feet too. That's an enormous operational space where they couldn't feel safe. And it affected German logistics and intelligence gathering. Without reliable high-altitude reconnaissance, the Luftwaffe had to rely on other methods to gather information about Allied positions and movements. Methods that were slower, less reliable, and easier for the Allies to deceive or disrupt. The funny part is, the Luftwaffe had their own aircraft that could have countered the P-51 at high altitude. The Ta-152H was a high-altitude interceptor, specifically designed to fight above 35,000 feet. It had a pressurized cockpit, extended wings, and an engine designed for extreme altitude performance. But the Ta-152H didn't enter service until January 1945. By then, the war was almost over. Germany was running out of fuel, running out of pilots, running out of time. The few Ta-152s that made it into service barely saw combat. If the Ta-152 had been available in 1944, high-altitude combat over Europe might have looked very different. You'd have had German interceptors specifically designed for extreme altitude going up against American P-51s that were operating at the edge of their performance envelope. That would have been interesting. But it didn't happen. The P-51 owned the high-altitude space for the last year of the war in Europe, and the Luftwaffe never found an effective counter. The same thing happened in the Pacific, but with a different dynamic. The Japanese had high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft too, modified versions of the Ki-46 Dyna. They'd been photographing Allied positions throughout the Pacific campaign with relative impunity. But when P-51s started arriving in the Pacific in 1945, Japanese reconnaissance pilots faced the same problem their German counterparts had. The Americans could now reach them at extreme altitude. The combat was similar. High-altitude intercepts at 35,000 to 40,000 feet, Japanese pilots trying to run or hide, American P-51 pilots chasing them down and shooting them out of the sky. The difference was that in the Pacific, the P-51 was competing with the P-47 Thunderbolt for the high-altitude intercept role. The P-47 was arguably better at extreme altitude than the P-51. It was designed from the start for high-altitude supercharged combat. It could reach 42,000 feet and still fight effectively. But the P-51 had better range. It could fly escort missions to Japan and back, which the P-47 couldn't do without extensive modifications. So the P-51 ended up being the more versatile aircraft in the Pacific too. Not because it was better at any one thing, but because it was good enough at everything. That's the real lesson of the P-51's high-altitude performance. Not that it was the best high-altitude fighter ever built. It wasn't. Specialized aircraft like the Spitfire VI or the P-47M were better in that specific role. But the P-51 was good enough at high-altitude work while also being excellent at medium altitude, good at low altitude, and having range that specialized interceptors couldn't match. It was the Swiss Army knife of World War II fighters. And in a war where logistics and versatility often mattered more than peak performance, that made it arguably the most important Allied fighter of the war. After the war, captured German pilots were interviewed about what Allied aircraft they feared most. The P-51 came up again and again, not because it was the fastest or the most heavily armed or the best climbing, but because it was everywhere, at every altitude, at every range, on every mission. You couldn't escape it. You couldn't outclimb it. You couldn't outrun it. And if you tried to hide at extreme altitude, thinking you were safe, a P-51 would climb up after you and prove you wrong. That's what Johnson did in March 1944. That's what dozens of P-51 pilots did throughout 1944 and 1945. They took an aircraft that everyone thought was limited to medium-altitude bomber escort and proved it could fight anywhere in the sky. The Ju-86P crews learned that the hard way. The high-altitude reconnaissance pilots who'd felt invincible for years suddenly found themselves vulnerable, and the Luftwaffe lost one of its most valuable intelligence-gathering capabilities because American fighters could reach places they weren't supposed to. All because a few pilots decided to push their aircraft past what the doctrine said they should do. All because the P-51 was better than anyone gave it credit for. And all because in war, assumptions about what's possible tend to get challenged by people who don't know they're supposed to be impossible. Johnson's kill at 37,000 feet opened the door. Other pilots walked through it. And by the end of the war, the idea of safe, high-altitude reconnaissance over Allied territory was dead. The P-51 had killed it. The aircraft that was supposed to be a low-altitude fighter had become the thing that high-altitude German pilots checked their six for. That's a pretty good legacy for a plane that North American aviation designed in 120 days to fill a British contract. And it all started with one pilot, one intercept, and one kill at an altitude where everyone said it couldn't be done. Hit subscribe for more World War II stories.